Howdy peeps. We are continuing on with the cardiovascular system, and next up is the heart. Okay, the heart is located in take your pick. I've heard this, let me write it. I've heard this pronounced mediastinum or mediastinum, so just take your pick. Sometimes I think I'll even switch back and forth. So, but this is basically between the lungs in the thoracic cavity and above the diaphragm. Okay. The heart itself tilts, kind of a janky heart, slightly to the left. So it points just a little bit that direction. The tip down here is called the apex of the heart, oddly enough. And it is surrounded by a few layers. If you remember from, I think that was day one or maybe day two. I think it was day one we started talking about the visceral peritoneum and the parietal pleura and all that. Well, the heart itself is covered. Well, let's back up. We'll start from the outside and go in. So the whole heart and everything inside of it is surrounded by what's called the fibrous pericardium. And so surrounds the entire heart. And essentially what this does is it's kind of the anchoring point for the heart to the, say it attaches to the diaphragm inferiorly. Diaphragm. And it's just behind the sternum, so it attaches to the posterior side of the sternum. And then also on the anterior side, it anchors to the vertebral column. Okay, it just kind of like holds it all there in place. Now, if you remember, there are two layers, one that surrounds the outside of the organ itself, and then another layer that lines the cavity that the organ is sitting in. Remember I brought in cling wrap and showed you how that works? So the layer, the serous membrane that lines the outside of the heart is the outside layer of the heart. It's called the visceral pericardium. Of the heart. In fact, because it is basically the outside layer of the heart, it has a second name. It's also known as the epicardium. Remember, epi means on top of. So it's on top of the heart. The visceral pericardium, and I'll demonstrate this here in a second. So here's the heart. The visceral pericardium, or the epicardium, is the outside layer of the heart. And then it comes up and then doubles back over on itself and forms the parietal pericardium. Okay, so you see there's like a little bit of space in between those two layers there. So the parietal pericardium lines essentially the inside layer of the fibrous pericardium. The cavity, the heart is sitting in. Okay. And so in between that space there, those two layers secrete serous fluid, and it acts like lubrication so that when the heart pumps, again, like I described, it doesn't kind of rub itself raw, is the way I describe it. So here's our heart for this demo. Here, this is a vegetable bag. Here are the visceral and parietal pericardium. What we're going to do is push this in to here. Okay. And now we've got this space in between this layer here that's lining the outside of the heart. This is the visceral pericardium that's actually touching the outside of the heart. And then we have this other layer that surrounds that. Now this is the parietal pericardium. Okay, and we get the space in between there so that when the heart pumps, it can move around and not rub raw. Okay, so visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium, and then if we took the whole dang thing and wrapped it in a fibrous layer, this is the fibrous pericardium, and this is what attaches it to the rest of the body. Okay, and you can kind of see how these two layers are essentially attached. This is the parietal pericardium and the fibrous pericardium. They're like right up next to each other. Okay. The wall of the heart itself, so if we took the heart and took a section of it and looked at it, let's, well, here, this outer layer, like we talked about, is called the epicardium. It's also known as the, as we said, visceral pericardium. Cardium. And then you have the sort of meaty layer. So here's, let's say this is the epicardium, is this layer. And then we actually have the muscle that you probably think of as the heart. And that layer is known as the myocardium, which is the muscular wall of the heart. Well, there is a special epithelial tissue that I'll make green that lines the inside of the heart and goes down into the blood vessels and lines the inside of those too. Well, in the heart, it's known as the endocardium. So it lines the inside of the walls of the heart. All right. Okay, the heart is essentially two pumps that are attached to each other. And the pumps have, well, they end up making 4 chambers. There's 4 chambers. Some of this you're probably already familiar with. You've got 2 atria. These are the upper. Atria is plural for atrium. You wouldn't say atriums, you say atria. These are the upper chambers, and they're relatively thin-walled. Upper thin-walled chambers. And then on the inferior part of the heart, you have two ventricles. Ventricles. And these are the lower, and they tend to be thicker walled. Especially the left. And the atria, they receive blood into the heart. And the the ventricles, they send blood out, either to the lungs or to the body. Okay. The heart is, I find it very difficult to draw, so I have this really simplified version that I use. Okay, we got valves, and we got valves. Okay. So this structure, so here's the right atrium, the left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle, and you've got this wall that separates the two. It's called the atrioventricular septum. I'm sorry, oops, my bad. Not atrioventricular. The interventricular. That's my bad. Interventricular, because it's in between the ventricles. There are atrioventricular septa too, but they're between the atrium and the ventricles. We're not going to talk about them. I already did, so you don't have to know it though. The interventricular septum is the septum, or the kind of wall between the two ventricles. Okay. Now, there are two sort of general types of valves in the heart. The ones that are between the atrium and the ventricle, this valve here and this valve here, both of those are known as atrioventricular, because they're between the atrium and the ventricle. Ventricular valves. I'm going to run out of space here. Each has a specific name. The one over here is called the tricuspid. So on the right, it's called the tricuspid. Tricuspid valve. And the one over here on the left, it actually has three names. It's known as the bicuspid, or the mitral, or you can call it the left atrioventricular valve. You can call this one the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve. As usual, take your pick, but if I refer to something as the tricuspid valve and you don't know what tricuspid means, then you're kind of in a situation, okay? The other valves, I'll use this diagram, but I'm gonna run out of room here writing. The valves that are leaving the ventricles here and here are known as semilunar valves. Semilunar, there and there, and this is for that and that. Semilunar valves, and they also have special names. And essentially what these valves do, they prevent the blood from flowing backwards because the blood is going to be flowing in through here and going out that way, and then in through here and going out that way. And the valves prevent the flow from going the opposite way. So let me get another sheet of paper and we'll talk about these two semilunar valves. The one from the right is going to the lungs, and so they call that the pulmonary circuit. So that is the, on the right is the pulmonary valve. And on the left, this blood is going out to the body. And so this is the aorta here, or will be the aorta. This one's called the aortic valve. Some people, they just get in the habit of saying the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve so that they can kind of get it straight in their head. It's technically, I guess, more correct to say it that way anyway. Let me redraw the heart. And I'm going to add little structures here. These are little masses of muscle. They're like extensions of the myocardium, the heart's wall, and they make these little finger-like projections inside the chambers. In fact, papillary means, I think, finger-like. These are called papillary muscles. And what they do is they have these kind of parachute-like strings that attach to the underside of these valve flaps. And what they do, like parachute strings, if the blood is going this direction, when that valve shuts, these parachute strings, they're called chordae tendineae. And this is frequently misspelled. Chordae tendineae. So you got E-A-E. Chordae tendineae. They prevent the flaps from going out backwards the wrong direction, right? So when that shuts, let's just draw that one chamber there. When those valves shut, it prevents the blood from going backwards, right? Because we want the blood to go this direction. And the chordae tendineae sit there and hold those trap doors of the valve in place so that they don't blow out the other direction, just like a parachute does. If the parachute going down didn't have those strings on there, then the parachute would just blow out backwards and the person would just fall to their death. Okay? So chordae tendineae attached to papillary muscles. Okay. So, where are we at? It's heart chambers again. So oops. The blood comes in through this is one of the vena, is that E2? Well, let's say the superior or inferior vena cava, we'll just call it for right now. So one, you got two actually. So you got one that's coming from up from the top of the body and one from the bottom of the body. Blood enters into first. So vena cava. And then it goes into the right atrium. And then goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then through the pulmonary valve, and then goes out through this blood vessel here is called the pulmonary trunk. And we're going to take a few steps out here, but then it's basically going to the lungs to pick up oxygen and then returns back to the heart. That circuit there is, well, actually, let me just stop and we'll talk about that in a sec. The other way, so this is the right atrium again, the right ventricle, and I'm going to make this blood blue because this is deoxygenated blood. I call it deoxy blood. Okay. Blood that comes back from the lungs has now got oxygen in it, right? So we'll make this oxygenated blood. And it's going to first come in through the left atrium. Through the bicuspid valve. To the left ventricle, then pass through the aortic valve, and then through the aorta, and then out to the body tissues, out to the body, where the oxygen is then used by the body, right? So it's going to come in here, go into there, and go out to the body. And then to the lungs. You're going to want to get to know this pathway starting at any point. Left ventricle. So if I say starting at the lungs, name the chambers, valves, and structures that blood will pass through the next, say, 5 steps, or say the next 8 steps. And I put something up on Canvas. Once you kind of really get going, I always think it's good if you can learn something, in one direction. If you can do it backwards, then you're sitting really pretty. So, everyone knows the alphabet forward, but how quickly can you say the alphabet backwards? Depends on how well you know the alphabet, right? So if you can do this backwards and forwards, then you're good. So the heart itself, so this is the anterior, and we're going to flip it around and look at the posterior side a little bit too. The heart itself, of course, is a muscle, and muscles need oxygen. So there are arteries, coronary arteries, that deliver blood to the heart itself. These are coronary, and this is anatomically only kind of correct. Okay, so these are coronary arteries. And then these deliver oxygenated blood to the heart, say, tissues itself, because it needs oxygen, just like every other tissue in the body. If we were to look at the very small ends of these, there are what are known as anastomoses that will kind of still, so if, let's say, this one over here gets blocked for some reason, the blood will still be able to continue across that anastomosis and still deliver blood to that section of the heart. So these little like kind of cross or shortcuts, I guess you might call them, are called anastomoses. And these basically connect smaller blood vessels or coronary arteries. So just like in case one gets blocked, I guess. Alrighty. One thing I wanted to point out, so the whole point is, there are also, they call them cardiac veins. They've changed it from coronary arteries to now they're called cardiac veins, because blood goes out in arteries and then gets returned back to the heart, right? So there are also cardiac veins that follow similar paths here and pick up the deoxygenated blood and deliver it back to the heart, right? There is one that comes around the posterior side here that ends up taking also a kind of a sharp turn. If you could go like inside the heart, it's delivering the deoxygenated blood from the heart back into the right atrium. So on some model hearts, they'll have a little blue dot there, and that's where the blood is coming back from around here, and it goes into the heart. This one here is called the coronary, again, they switch names, sinus. I'm pointing that out because that's one of the structures that you need to know for the lab practical. Okay, so let's just do the blood flow again. So we're just going to draw a really kind of simple heart. And let's put some, that's your right lung, and then we've got another left lung, and this is the wow, that's really bad, head, and then the rest of the body I'll just draw like there's some hips and there's some legs, right? Okay, so deoxygenated blood comes in from the body, either from the head or from the lower part of the body, and comes in through the right atrium. Then it goes into the right ventricle, and then it leaves the heart and either goes out to the left lung or let's hop over there to the right lung, right? There it picks up oxygen. So then when it comes back, it returns Ooh, how am I going to do this? Back into the left atrium. And let's just stop right there. That circuit from the heart to the lungs and back. So from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart is called the pulmonary circuit. So heart, lungs, and back to the heart again is the pulmonary circuit. Now that oxygenated blood is going to come in from the right, left, boy, long spring break, left atrium, left ventricle, and then go out to the body. And it's either going to go up to the head or down to the rest of the body. And then it's going to lose its oxygen, go back to the heart to pick up more oxygen, right? So going from the heart to the body and then back to the heart. This is known as the systemic circuit. I know that's super messy, but the take-home message here, if you're going from the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen and then back to the heart, that's the pulmonary circuit, and then from the heart out to the body to deliver the oxygen and then back to the heart, that's the systemic circuit. Okay, one thing I want to point out here is I've been drawing deoxygenated blood in blue and oxygenated blood in red, right? So, deoxygenated blood. And red is oxygenated blood. So one thing to point out here is that does not equal arteries, always. And blue does not always mean veins. Okay, that's important to point out because depending on which circuit we're in, if we're in the pulmonary circuit, returning blood to the heart, this is oxygenated, but these are called veins, even though they're carrying oxygenated blood. So arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. Whether or not that blood is oxygenated or deoxygenated. If it's leaving the heart, they're known as arteries, and the veins carry blood toward the heart. Because again, let's just do the pulmonary circuit. So there's the heart, here's a lung, here's a lung. You're delivering deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs in the pulmonary arteries, and they're deoxygenated, right? Now, the blood that's returning to the heart now has oxygen in it, so we would make it red, and those are pulmonary veins. And if you look at a model, they're going to be red, or a picture, they're going to be red. So red does not always mean artery. Depends on which circuit. If you're in the systemic, then they are red. If they're in the pulmonary circuit, then they're going to be blue. Okay, so don't get confused by that. I'm going to stop there and pick up part 2 later.